Hello and welcome to Tiller Talk. My name is Cynthia Tipton and I am the Senior Marketing Manager for WestBred Wheat. And I'm joined here today with Grant Mehring, our WestBred Technical Product Manager out of North Dakota. Welcome, Grant.
Yes, thank you. Grant Mehring. I cover the North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota territory alongside my colleague Troy Seiler, and we help support the winter wheat and spring wheat varieties grown in the region.
Great, so we are really happy to have you here with us today. We are going to be talking about best field production practices for wheat. Now you have 3 different approaches that you like the growers to look at so they can increase their potential for yield in this 2021 growing season. Can you tell us what those 3 approaches are?
Absolutely, Cynthia. I'm going to go through a story of 3 different ways to think about how to increase your yields and increase your productivity for 2021 wheat. The first one is going to be what we call the law of the minimum. And then we'll look at kind of a checklist of early season, in season, and the end of the season, moving through management and trying to make the right decisions at every step of the way. And then we'll finish up with thoughts on testing, how to test to make the right decisions moving forward in your operation.
That sounds great. So obviously we want to get into a lot more detail about what these 3 approaches mean. So let's talk about the first one, which is law of the minimum. So how should a grower approach those 1 or 2 most limiting factors for their yield?
The law of the minimum is called Liebig's law of the minimum. And really it's a classical fundamental way to think about agriculture where, eloquently put it, yields can rise no higher than your most limiting factor. Limiting factors could be many such things wherever you farm in North America wheat production. Here, you'll see on the screen, this is soil-borne wheat mosaic virus. This is a damaging disease that you see in parts of the Pacific Northwest. And you can see in parts of this field, it's taking most of the yield. However, there's a couple varieties that are doing much better due to some genetic resistance. Another issue that you might have could be something called the wheat stem sawfly, pictured here. Wheat stem sawfly is an insect that infects early in the season, lives in the stem, and as we get towards harvest, if we have a little bit of wind, your wheat can look like this. There's large pockets of wheat growing regions that have this issue, and where your wheat looks like this, it might be hard to get that wheat in the combine. That is the most limiting factor, the wheat stem sawfly. Another issue, if you're in irrigation or if you're in a more rain-fed area where we grow wheat, could be lodging. Where we have heavy rains as that wheat is growing tall and getting heavy, if you get a rain, you can have lodging. And lodging, when that wheat goes flat, it both limits your yield, but you also can't combine near as fast. Now, these are 3 examples. I think it's a really healthy activity to, as you're sitting here listening, perhaps write down the 1 or 2 issues that on part of your farm or the area you cover in wheat that hurt your yields the most, the 1 single issue. Maybe it's low sulfur, maybe it's another nutrient, maybe it's acid soils, perhaps it's any other diseases that I haven't mentioned today. But there's probably 1 issue that at least on some of your acres needs to be taken care of first before you work on other things because that is taking most of your yield. And that's the law of the minimum.
That's such a great insight to give to our growers because obviously there's lots of decisions they have to make. But if you start with one of those really big yield limiting factors, you're going to just set yourself up more for success.
Indeed.
Great. Okay, so that was our first step that we talked about, your first approach. Your second approach is about stepwise management decisions and practices for each of the production stages. So let's start with pre-planting. What does a grower want to think about?
When it comes to growing a wheat crop, there are so many management decisions starting before you put anything in the ground, moving through towards harvesting and storing that grain. Many, many management decisions. As Cynthia mentioned, I'm going to talk about 3 areas of production where there's a lot of little details you could think about that when put together might make the difference towards increased yield, increased productivity. So the first one I want to hit on are really decisions you make before you even think about planting, before you get out to the field. These are pre-season, pre-planting decisions. I have 4 of them listed for you here. So the first one, in wheat, I would encourage you to think about buying certified seed wheat. At WestBred, we call this certified seed only wheat, but what certified seed wheat brings you is an opportunity for increased yield, better vigor in that seed, a pure seed without noxious weeds, inert matter, and most importantly, it helps you buy the newest varieties. And those varieties lead us to step number 2. I firmly believe in wheat. There are opportunities to pick the right variety or varieties to plant on your farm to have increased productivity. How would you think about this? Well, first we need to look at a bunch of data that we have available. Lots of different types of data. We'll get into that later, but now you've found a couple varieties you like. Well, depending on your acres, I really encourage 2 or more varieties. When you pick one, you're betting on the one variety that will do best, but the environment, the weather could say otherwise. And so having a couple varieties, depending on acres, really can help kind of hedge your risk against the environment. And then, as you move through years, you have 2, 3 varieties on your farm. I encourage getting rid of that variety that's just not doing as well and adding in a new one, going through another year or 2 and cycling through new varieties so you're continually finding the best varieties on your farm. All right, we're buying new varieties. We're thinking about our variety mix. Now we're getting that seed. We know what seed we're getting. And this is really important as well. Seeding rates in wheat matter. They really do. 2 concepts I'd like to kind of cover here. 1, you might decide to plant a bushel per acre, 1.5 bushels per acre, or 2 bushels. That's a volume. What you can do there is an issue that comes up. Now think about seed lots in wheat. Some seed lots are really small seeded wheat, and some seed lots are really large seeded wheat. If you seed both of those varieties that are small versus large at the same bushels, 2 bushels per acre, you could end up with something like 500,000 seeds per acre difference between a small seeded wheat and a large seeded wheat. You're probably underseeding one of those varieties and overseeding one of them when in reality you need to hit the sweet spot. So plant on seeds per acre. And how do you get there? Well, you're going to take your germination that you get on your seed lot. You're going to take your seeds per pound, your seed weight. You're going to, before the season, do that quick seeding rate math. It's not that hard. Do the math, and then when you get in the air seeder or when you get your drill ready, you know to plant at 120 pounds per acre. Maybe it's 110, or maybe it's 132 pounds per acre. You know the pounds, you can equate that to bushels then, and you're planting at the right population. Population matters for increased yield and optimizing lodging and the performance of your varieties. And now lastly, we've got the certified seed, we've got a variety, we know the right seeding rate, we're going to pick that seed up. And we don't know exactly what the environment will be like that wheat is going to grow in right when we put it in the ground. And the best way to hedge against that is really a fungicide or a fungicide-insecticide seed treatment put on that seed will help that wheat overcome cold weather, wet weather, the fungal diseases or insect diseases in the soil, and help that wheat go from germination to emergence in the season when then we can really start managing our wheat. And Cynthia, those are my pre-planting decisions, things to think about before you even get out in the field.
That's great, Grant. And I know WestBred has been talking about planting seeds per acre versus bushels per acre for a couple of years now. Have you seen in the industry-wide adoption of this planting strategy?
Yeah, definitely. At WestBred, we talk about certified seed. We talk about when you buy a variety, you'll get a sheet of paper that tells you what seeding rate to seed at on the whole. And yes, I do see a lot of attention given. I just get a lot of questions on all varieties, not just WestBred. What is the optimal seeding rate? And I think that farmers are paying attention to seeding rate ever more.
Yeah, I think that's great. I know a lot of universities have been talking about it as well. All right, so we've talking about all of our best management practices in season. So we talked about pre-plant. So let's talk about planting. What can a grower do at planting that will help maximize their yield?
Now we're getting to the planting time. We are ready to get in the field, it's trafficable, and we're going to plant wheat. What do we need to do? Well, before we even talk about the steps, I have this thought. It's very important that you really get one chance in most fields to seed your wheat. And how you seed it, how everything goes, the preparation put into it, when that seed hits the soil, that seed to soil contact, how it goes, increases or decreases your yield ceiling. It is so important to plant wheat correctly with everything done in the background that you can to verify success. And so with that said, here's 7 things to think about when you're just about to get into the field and plant. The first 3 are related to your machinery, whether it's a drill or an air seeder. Different things to pay attention to, but similar thread. When you're going to plant wheat, check your seed depth. We want that wheat seeded at an optimal seeding rate, about 1.5 or so inches deep. If we seed too shallow, we risk root lodging. If we seed too deep, unless you're in some of the P&W deep furrow country where you need to know what varieties do best, but unless you're there, if you seed too deep, you're going to decrease your emergence. So we want to seed at the sweet spot. Field to field, take the minute, dig up a few seeds, and make sure that you're planting at a 1.5 inches. Don't underseed, don't overseed. It's a simple thing to check. At the same time, let's be calibrated. Let's take a look at that seeder, air seeder, perhaps here, and let's make sure we're planting the right population. Well, first we're going to key in how many pounds we want to seed, but more importantly, different wheat varieties, different seed lots, have different shaped seeds. Some are shorter or fatter, some are long and slender. And the way those seeds are shaped do flow over the meter slightly differently. So let's do our calibration, seed lot to seed lot, as you switch out varieties, and make sure we know the seeding rate that variety should be planted at, so we're hitting the target population. At the same time, let's make sure everything's running properly in our air seeder or in our drill. Let's make sure seed is dropping out of every row unit. I have gotten the question fairly often. We had a run plug in our air seeder. What do we do? We've got 10-foot skip on a 60-foot air seeder, something like that. And those are problems you just don't want to have, and we can fix them with a simple check. Now we've got our tractor ready, our seeder. We're thinking about when and where should we plant. The when. Depending on where you grow wheat, there are optimal planting dates. It depends on where you're at. I know my region really well. The earlier you seed spring wheat, the better. For winter wheat, generally speaking, the earlier, but not always. Know your area and know your optimal planting date so that you can be ready. You have all your machinery ready to go, your fertility planned, and you're ready to seed to maximize yield, because planting date does matter in wheat. At the same time, where are you planting your wheat? The where is a really fun discussion. Crop rotations in wheat are really dynamic and different across the entire North America wheat growing region. Everybody's rotation is different, very different, depending on where you're at. So I won't get into the exact rotations, but I'll give you two ideas. There's sort of two competing ways to think about your wheat rotation. First, you might be thinking, what crops should I seed my wheat after that will give me the highest yields? Something where there's more moisture or more nutrients left. There are differences there. In my region, for instance, field peas are better than sunflowers, as an example. There's another way to think about it. You have wheat in your rotation. What crops am I growing after my wheat that benefit the most from the wheat? Maybe it's the moisture that wheat isn't quite using. Maybe it's the weed control you get in your wheat. But either way, if you're thinking wheat first or other crops first, have a great crop rotation. And now lastly here at our getting ready to plant, two thoughts on nutrients. First and foremost, we know how big of a deal starter fertilizer is in wheat. That early season phosphorus, for instance, helps vigor, it helps tillering, and starter fertilizers matter. So if you have the opportunity, if you have the machinery that can do it, I encourage really paying attention to your starter fertilizer. And then, nutrients, let's make sure we're soil sampling, we're taking a look at our farm, and we are applying nutrients as we need for the wheat. We know that wheat is a big nitrogen user, it's a big phosphorus user, it needs some sulfur. Have a plan so that none of those nutrients will be minimum, will be limited in your fields and your wheat can really go. Well, that's a lot of practices and there's more, but that planting window is so important. So many management decisions lead up to that planting window and being successful.
Oh, absolutely. So obviously we talk now about pre-planting and then at planting. So when growers are looking at these best production practices, I'm assuming there's something they can do in season as well?
Most certainly. Now we're moving into the in-season window. The wheat is growing and we're going to manage that wheat. What things are best to give us that yield lift, that productivity lift? Well, before I get into the actual practices, I think it'd be important to talk about what we're doing in season. we're responding to the needs of that wheat crop. In season in your wheat crop, you can respond to things like rainfall, too much or too little, the weed spectrum that you're seeing, the fungal pests or insect pests that are in your field, and you can apply pesticides or nutrients as needed based on things you're seeing. So I really just encourage scouting your fields, walking your fields, having a good look at them, because in season we can respond to that wheat and help it really go. 4 areas that I have listed here that are key in wheat. The first one is weeds. We know in most of our wheat growing regions we have some troublesome weeds. Some areas more than others. We have downy brome or kochia, or the list goes on, feral rye. Some of these weeds are easy to control, some are more difficult. But in wheat, we have the opportunity to control our weeds. A lot of available products are still on the market for some of those most weed-resistant weeds, those most troublesome weeds. So I encourage you to use wheat, the good weed controlling wheat, to help set up your other crops, your corn, your soybeans, whatever else you have. Wheat offers that opportunity. Here at Bayer, we have a great Bayer crop protection portfolio. Something like the Husky brand family of products helps set up your wheat for success. And what you're doing when you're killing weeds and controlling them is you're leaving the moisture and the nutrients for the wheat crop to make grain and to have yield. After weeds, another pest issue would be fungal pests or insect pests. So I want to encourage you to be scouting and applying your fungicides and insecticides as needed. It kind of goes without saying, but in our wheat growing regions, we have areas that grow, put on very little fungicide, maybe 0 passes or just 1. We have other areas with longer growing seasons that maybe put on up to 3 fungicide passes. So know what your region needs, be scouting for your fungal pests, whether it's rusts or head scab or any other fungal pest, and think about the fact that fungicides help keep your wheat healthier, keep them greener, lift, yield ceiling lift. A product like Prosaro at Bayer Crop Science would be something that we would recommend for head scab, but it helps you get your yields to really a level that's satisfiable. And what you're doing is you're increasing your yield level, keeping that wheat growing longer. So that's what we can do with fungicides. Think about one more pass. Perhaps, if warranted in your region, that can be a way to add yield. Now we get back over to the nutrients. There are some folks who put down most of their nutrients pre-plant. In a lot of winter wheat, we put it up at green up. But I just want to encourage you to think about what your crop needs with top dressing or side dressing. Perhaps we want to put on some nitrogen or some other nutrient late in the season. Think about nitrogen. The earlier you put it on, the more you're going to yield. The later you put it on, the more that nitrogen helps your protein. So use nitrogen to benefit the wheat crop you're growing. And the last in-season decision is lodging, keeping that wheat standing tall. When your wheat lodges or when it falls on the ground, number 1, you're losing yield. Number 2, you're losing harvestability. You're going to be combining much slower, much more painstakingly. Well, I encourage you, think about lodging in your wheat crop if you're in an area that sees it. Plant varieties of strong straw, plant the right seeding rates for lodging, and if needed, apply a plant growth regulator to keep that plant a little shorter and have a little thicker stem. Because nobody's got time for lodged wheat.
Oh, definitely no one wants lodged wheat. That's just one of those most frustrating things in the world. Now, obviously, the key to being proactive in the in-season is getting out and scouting your fields. How often would you recommend that a grower goes out and checks their field?
Cynthia, you really nailed it. It is important to get out in your wheat fields, as we said earlier. As a rough estimate, we want to get out there weekly and take a look at how our wheat crop's looking. And especially after key weather events, whether it's hail or a big wind or a big rain that might change the diseases or the lodging, we need to get out there about weekly.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we had 3 approaches that we were going to talk about today. We've talked about the law of the minimum, and now we've talked through the in-season stepwise management practices. So the third approach was testing. So why don't you take us through what kind of testing you recommend that our growers do?
We've talked about management practices. What are the best management practices to help increase productivity for next year? Well, how do you make those decisions? You go to talks, you hear people give you ideas, but at the end of the day, we need to look at testing. Getting some data, looking at the data, or generating it ourselves. So there's kind of a framework I'll lay out here. We start with small plots. This is foundational research. These are those small plots, best parts of fields typically, and that helps us to really identify the treatments that matter, that make the yield go. Moving from small plots, then we can go up a little bit bigger. We think about the farms where you're at, the machinery you have. Doing trials, such as strip trials, where you plant one pass of a variety or one pass of a fungicide, those types of trials are using the fertility on your farm, the seeding type machinery on your farm, the tillage, the fertility. And when you use testing on your own farm, it really helps compare and contrast to that small plot. Now then a little bit bigger would be just the split field approach. For some products, it makes sense to just take a look at a field, split it, one fungicide here, no fungicide here, as an example, and help make decisions for your farm based on split fields. It can be a really quick and fast way to see differences. And especially if you do a few of those split fields on your farm, wow, you can really find things. And then lastly, now we go kind of aggregate. The biggest type of data would be looking at your whole operation. You could look at a tool like Climate Field View. You see all of your wheat acres and the good ones, the bad ones, where the yields go. We can also look even larger. Survey data is available, USDA data or surveys from elsewhere that can find us regional aggregates and really start to see what are the pests or the management practices that matter in your region. And I think that these 4 ways of approaching your testing, don't just use one of them, but use 2, 3, or 4 of them, hopefully all, and you'll find the best management practices to take to your farm.
That's great. I mean, I think the more data you have, the better decision making you can make, right? I mean, that's
Absolutely
logical. And then you take that information and you can choose the right varieties for your farm and the right practices that we just talked about and increase your yield. All right, so we are going to take just a little fun break here, and we're going to do something that we call Wheat Comes to Mind. So this is where I'm going to ask you some rapid fire questions just for a little fun and just lighten things up for a little bit.
All right.
All right, you ready? Okay. So, approximately how many kernels are in a head of wheat?
I would say roughly 60.
All right, well, our answer says 50, but I guess it depends on how big your head of wheat is, right? If you have 50 or 60 kernels. Okay. What is your favorite wheat growing state?
Oh, wow. Well, North Dakota is my home state, but not picking North Dakota, I'll probably go with Washington. I've been through the Palouse of Washington and elsewhere in Washington. It is some really fun wheat country.
Beautiful country, absolutely beautiful. Okay, true or false? Wheat is the most harvested crop in the world.
That is true. Most acres of wheat.
That is true. You know, people often talk about corn, they talk about soybeans, but they forget that wheat is a really large crop out there too. So very important to feeding the world. All right, so what was your first ag job?
My first ag job was working at NDSU, North Dakota State, under a gentleman named Dr. Joel Ransom, and we were working in small plot research in cereals and corn.
Excellent. Anything to do with corn rootworm?
Oh, yes, I did also work in corn rootworm in my first job at a private company, which was Monsanto back then, and we dug roots and sprayed off roots and raided corn rootworm all day for quite a long time.
Gotta love a good corn rootworm dig. Okay, I've done a few of those in my time as well. What does the acronym CSO stand for?
CSO is an important acronym at WestBred. CSO means Certified Seed Only. Talked about that earlier in the certified wheat section, but certified seed only just means that you can't plant that wheat back on your farm after you've already grown it. You need to buy new seed each year.
Right, and new seed is great if you want to have the highest yields, so that's awesome. All right, what is your favorite food made from wheat?
Wow, I'm a wheat guy through and through, and actually it would be pizza. Pizza once a week is important to me.
Pizza's my favorite food.
Yeah.
What toppings do you like?
Well, actually my favorite topping is anchovies. Do you like anchovies?
You know, I've never tried them. I guess I should probably get over my idea of them being yucky and maybe put them on a pizza. I typically go more like sausage, pepperoni, those types of things. So maybe I'll have to branch out. Okay, what is your favorite farm animal?
Wow, farm animal for me, actually would probably be the goat. I just like seeing goats climbing up on everything and fun.
They are kind of fun to watch. Lots of videos of goats out there doing funny things, and they'll eat your grass. So you may not have to mow your lawn as much. That's always a plus. All right, and what was the first crop that you harvested?
Wow, for me, it was, it was barley. Working in small pot research, it was barley, and then probably a week after that, it was wheat.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for humoring us with a little bit of lighthearted fun here. But obviously, we've really enjoyed having you here with us today, and you gave so much great content. So why don't you wrap up for us kind of the key takeaways that you want to give our growers about best field production practices?
Absolutely. Let's take it to some conclusions. And the conclusions I would have for you are fivefold. I think as you think through these, make a call on your own operation, this can help make the difference for next year. Well, it would start with questioning your yield potential. Yield potential is, we know what our average farm yields are, but are you leaving yield on the table? I'm guessing the answer is probably yes. And hopefully some of these management practices can help you move that yield. Well, before you make the decisions about what to do to increase your yield, I think you need to know your cost of production. Cost of production is critical. Do you have room for new management practices? How much money is left in the budget? But knowing your cost of production helps to make more informed decisions when looking at management. And then we need to just always be doing the little things right. Little differences compound and make a big difference over time. Little might be planting the right day, or checking your seed depth, or just making sure your planter's ready. These are little things that matter. Now, we talked about management practices. My next idea for you would be to take two new ones for next year, this current 2021 year that's coming up. Think about something that's free. It doesn't cost you money, it just takes some time or some effort. And then think about something that might cost some money, a new input, be it a pesticide or a nutrition, something that costs money. And if you combine those two things, one's free, one costs a little bit, it'd be a good approach to think about a new practice on your farm. And then lastly, we only have so many years to put a crop in the ground, and I do believe firmly in this idea of making small changes every year. Small changes. Don't do exactly what you did last year, but make a small incremental change each year. They compound on one another and keep moving forward. And those are my conclusions.
Those are great. And I really hope our growers appreciate all the information you've shared with them today. And I know we've got some questions coming in. So the first question is what should a farmer be testing when they're doing like a split field or a side-by-side trial? What's the best thing for them to be testing?
As you heard, I do believe firmly in trying to do a little bit of testing on your farm every year. I think that a split field approach, some things are best suited to split fields. It might be a fungicide, for instance, easy to just skip a few passes or put a half a field. I think nitrogen-rich strips or fertilizer-rich strips bump the rate up just a little bit, and you can see how it looks. Some of these things are easier to test in a split field, and nutrition, fertilizers, and fungicides being two of them.
Okay, that's great. Another question we have. So are wheat fields as beautiful in person as they are in our photos?
Yeah, wheat is quite an eye-dropping crop. I would say, honestly, when I'm out in the field, maybe parts of western North Dakota where it's rolling, the wheat is just waving near harvest, and it is really spectacular in person. Also good in the picture, but better in person.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in some wheat fields, and especially when they're closer to harvest and you can just run your hand across the top of that wheat. It's so soft, it's like you're just petting softness. It's fun. So, okay, another question we have. Where can a grower get an optimal seeding rate? You made a passion plea that, knowing seeds per acre versus seeds per pound is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Where do you get an optimal seeding rate? For us at WestBred, we want to get that information to you. We have what's called a wheat insight sheet when you buy our varieties, and it will have the optimal seeding rate on there, whether you're planting early or late, high rainfall or low rainfall. So you'll get it there. But also just be talking to your seed seller or your agronomist and really try to get that seeding rate dialed in.
Great. Another question we had came in, again, goes to kind of the testing area. So how do you collect the data that you're getting from these tests?
Yeah, there's a lot of different types of trials or testing that you have on your farm. There's a couple different ways to look at it. One great tool that comes to mind really quickly is Climate Field View. If you have Field View, you can take a look at what you're doing on your farm and easily draw polygons, compare. But if you don't have that tool, another way to do it is if you have a weigh wagon. Just take a look at your grain cart, and excuse me, your grain cart, not weigh wagon, but take a look at your grain cart. Harvest your strips, dump it, harvest another strip, dump it, and you can get the yield, the weights on those. And then, as always in wheat, we want to be taking samples because it's not always just about yield. We need to know protein, we need to know the quality of the wheat, how does it look, and so you can either use Climate Field View or weigh it yourself.
Okay, now we have one last question before we wrap up, and that is, the grower says, okay, I'm doing all of these things you've mentioned. What else do I do to increase my yield? What else is out there?
Yeah, actually, Cynthia, I've gotten that question a fair bit. A lot of these management practices, some farmers are doing most of them, or they've got a really well buttoned up management strategy. There are a lot of other things that I didn't talk about on here. There really are. There's micronutrients, for instance. There are things like variable seeding rates in wheat. I do know some folks who do that, who plant low populations next to high populations on the same field. Those would be two things I can think of. Take a look, pay attention to your micros, make sure they're not limiting, and then look at variable seeding rate. And there's more, but I think that's important, that there are other things to do to keep the wheat going up on your farm.
That's wonderful. Well, Grant, thank you again so much for being here. You came in from North Dakota just to help us out with this, and we really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us here today on this edition of Tiller Talk. You can also find our written version of this, which is called The Tiller, on WestBred.com. On WestBred.com, you can also find all of our product information. You can find your local seed supplier, and you can also find the contact information for other people like Grant who work for WestBred but in other geographies. So there are definitely people out there who can help you walk through these different approaches on how you can increase yield moving into 2021 and beyond. So please enjoy the rest of your Commodity Classic, and thank you for joining us here at Tiller Talk.